Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Rose and Rubini podcast. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about the UK Chancellor's growth plan and the economic gamble that it presents for the UK. It's been a really eventful week. We saw both the US Fed and the Bank of England raise its policy rates by quite a bit to tackle rampant inflation. We saw a far-right government being elected into as a consequence of the Italian general elections over the weekend. And Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization of Russian troops, clearly sort of escalating the war. But amongst all of this, a major, sort of economic change in the UK with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, announcing the growth plan for the UK. Let's break it down because there's quite a few components to this. It impacts both households and companies. But to kick things off, Brunello, what are the specific measures this plan has for households?
So as you said, the government has announced what they call the mini budget, but it wasn't mini at all. Actually, it was quite a major overhaul of the UK taxation system, both for households and companies. There were some new measures, and some other measures that were planned have been scrapped. So the amount of tax announcements that we had in this sort of mini budget is actually bigger than what you had in regular budgets over the years. You mentioned households, which is a good starting point. Well, for sure, in the income tax, there have been two major changes. The first one is the basic tax rate, instead of being 20%, is going to be 19%, which means that virtually every taxpayer in the country would benefit from that because it's a rate that affects everybody. But then there's a measure specifically deemed for the higher earners, those who were to pay 45% over and beyond £150,000 per year. Admittedly, it was a very limited amount of people, number of people affected by this one. Also, revenues were not extraordinarily big. It's been controversial because you know that when you start touching that kind of taxpayers, they generally have the chance of either entering schemes by which they can avoid paying that tax, or they can relocate the residency somewhere else. So in general, those measures, one was introduced in France, for example, a few years ago, eventually get scrapped because the revenues deriving from that is small, and actually they can do more harm than good. Nonetheless, in a period in which clearly the government needs to balance its budget over time, so at least put these public finances in order, and lots of people are suffering given high inflation, rampant gas prices and so on. You want to give the signal that you're still taking the money from the better off rather than the others. But anyway, they scrapped this 45%, and then there has been a change in the stamp duty for home buyers, and effectively the thresholds have been raised so that they claim that at least 200,000 people per year will not pay stamp duty at all. So there's quite a significant package for households to begin with.
And that's for households, but there's some particularly significant ones for companies as well. And the chancellor itself, even in his previous role, had a very wanted to make a very pro-business environment in the UK. What are the new measures for companies?
So I would say the most important one is that the planned increase in the corporation tax from 19% to 25%, that was due to occur in coming months, will not happen. And the corporation tax will remain at 19%. In this case, instead, I think is a good measure because you want to make sure the companies are based in your country and therefore they are not gonna shop around for the country in which they have the lowest corporate tax rate. You need to find the right balance. Some country has no corporation tax, others are very limited, 5%, maybe 10%. That's too little. It means that somewhere in the system there's a bit of a scheme or games going on, God knows, right? 15 to 20%, 25% at the very top is kind of the right amount. 20% is about right. So it's a good thing that to some extent this corporation tax has been kept as it was instead of increasing. Then they have also the diverted profit tax that was also expected to be increased from 25% to 31%. Also that one has been cancelled. And the other aspect is that some treatment of dividends has been made more favorable for the owners of companies. And finally, there has been the introduction of new investment zones around the UK with enhanced tax reliefs and various relief from stamp duties that can encourage investment in the more depressed areas of the country. So to some extent, the incentives to the corporations have also been quite extensive. And in this case, I would say mostly welcome.
Right. And let's put all these things into context. What sort of do you think is the UK government really aiming to do with these cuts? As we know, there's plenty of things going on with the economy and geopolitically. But even more importantly, how credible are these measures and these promises?
So in their aim, they like to increase growth potential to around 2.5%. Used to be around that level years ago, I would say prior to the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when it began. We remember Northern Rock and whatever ensued from that. Then it collapsed to 25 to 175, where is more or less now, could be 1.5, God knows the exact number. So the government will like to see an increase in growth potential to 2.5% again, and also see an increase in wages and via an increase in productivity. So it would be sort of virtuous increase in wages, because when the wages increase in line with productivity, the unit labor cost remains in check. That means that there's no domestically generated inflation. All this needs to be proven. In general, governments tend to put some how can I say, caveats or safeguarding elements somewhere in the system to make sure that if something doesn't go exactly according to plan, the entire construct doesn't derail. In this case, that wasn't exactly the case. The government has just announced lots of tax cuts unfunded by increased taxes, in fact, other taxes, clearly, or any other increased savings in spending in other areas of the system. So there are various ways of doing tax cuts. This is kind of totally unfunded, financed by deficits, meaning extra borrowing. So extra borrowing in this occasion means an increase in long-term rates, because you would have to convince investors to purchase gilts. But long-term rates are already increasing because, first, the Bank of England is itself increasing the policy rate. And secondly, the Bank of England has also started QT, which is the process of selling prices. When you sell prices, the price goes down, the yield goes up. So unfortunately, you have kind of a triple whammy on long-term rates, which is the reason why they have increased so much over the last few days. Now, what is kind of surprising, if you wish, is that when there's an increase in rates, that both in the policy segment of the curve, so the very short end, or at the longer end, that tends to strengthen the currency, which of course, because investors clearly are attracted by higher rates of return. But in this case, the plan is so incredible or little credible or not believed or trusted by investors that in spite of raising rates, the currency collapsed. And so the sterling collapsed, especially versus the dollar, almost to parity, 103, then it jumped back to around 108. But this is unseen. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the pre-global financial crisis exchange rate when pound was trading at 2 versus the dollar. Now we are almost parity, which means halving the value versus the dollar. This means a serious loss of credibility by the country vis-a-vis international investors' confidence.
Right. There's another sort of really big risk as well. Monetary and fiscal policy aren't working in the same direction anymore. And there's a number of competing priorities. And you say in your reviews letter that the UK government doesn't seem to understand that point. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. So during the global financial crisis, they adopted a kind of a curious mix, which was fiscal prudence and monetary easing. Generally, it goes the other way around. You have fiscal profligacy, if you want, and monetary prudence. Anyway, they chose this one. Wasn't optimal, and that became apparent during the global pandemic crisis, when they actually realized that it was so much better if there was some form of coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. So fiscal policy became extremely accommodative, and monetary policy monetized that extra deficit and debt, okay, which provided that monetary and fiscal response that allowed all countries around the world, the planet, to get out of that incredible shock that was represented by the pandemic. But then, soon after the end of the pandemic, monetary and fiscal policy start working in separate directions. So monetary policy start thinking about rising inflation, and fiscal policy start to think about supporting economic activity, which is more or less the usual division of labor between the two. But what's the problem? That can work in normal circumstances, whereby governments, perhaps to enhance the popularity among the wider population, support economic activity with easy fiscal policy, and then it's the central bank that is the warden of the system and says, I need to increase interest rate to make sure that inflation doesn't go out of control. That in normal circumstances would work. But when you have supply side shocks, when you have disruption in global supply chains, then it's a bit of a problem if monetary and fiscal policy act in different directions. Why? Because if fiscal policy is eased by the government in order to support economic activity, that tends to be, in these specific circumstances, inflationary, defeating the purpose of the central bank. Conversely, if the central bank increases rates to combat inflation, that increase in interest rates tend to depress economic activity, so defeating the purpose of what the government is doing. So unfortunately, the two sides of macroeconomic policies, in order to pursue their own objective, are kind of undermining each other. So unless there is some form of understanding between the two sides of what they should be doing, it's very hard to get an optimal policy mix. And in all this, we haven't even mentioned the sanction to Russia and all sorts of constraints to imports and exports and whatever not, right? So it already, like this, is quite complicated. Now, in this setting, the government in the UK announced an unfunded, huge tax cuts plan, as it was acting in isolation, as investors didn't matter, as the Bank of England didn't exist, as the political cycle was almost the only thing that mattered, because clearly this government wants to gain credibility, and potentially the Conservative Party wants to shrink the big distance that now they have with Labour in the polls. But this is not the way to do. Now, Liz Truss says she's the new Thatcher. Maybe. I hope she is. Problem is that Thatcher was fiscally prudent, first and foremost. Yes, she did tax cut at some point, but not straight away. No. She was of the type that you need to earn your future well-being. So effectively, the idea was, let's increase taxes first. Let's put the fiscal house in order before being able to cut taxes for everybody. And this is what she did. She in fact increased the VAT quite substantially and other taxes before cutting taxes in the second half, let's say, of a political career. And let's not forget, she did her government collapse on the famous or infamous poll tax, which was a tax to finance local authorities. So, as usual, the government will have to deal with the problem of taxation. If you think about the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. We are always at the very heart of how democratic systems work. And this is not a surprise. But it cannot be only for political reasons that some plans are announced. You need to think through many times before doing something like this. Clearly, there was a huge vote of no confidence by international investors on how the government has acted, and most likely also on what they have announced.
Right. I mean, it seems like, whatever the government response was, markets have understood well and, have reacted very quickly. And so have voters. There's a very solid Labour lead now, with them polling at 42% versus the Conservatives is 33%. And all of Labour, sort of all potential Labour allies, the Lib Dems, the SNPs, the Greens, collectively at 20%. So the Conservatives not doing very well at all. Something that almost anyone could have predicted once we knew that Liz Truss was poised to win the general election as she did. But this is definitely something we'll I think, keep debating and hearing about, especially as the cost of living crisis and rampant inflation become sort of broader conversations in the electoral cycle. And as they say, the only two constants in life are death and taxes. But as always, Bruno, thanks so much for your advice and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.